Widow, 80 years old, steps slowly into the courtroom of Judge Judy. At first glance, it seems like nothing more than a routine small claims case involving $2,541 in unpaid rent. 4. She's dressed modestly in a neatly pressed floral dress, gripping a worn leather purse close to her chest, leaning on a wooden cane as she moves with visible difficulty. 4. Her hands shake as she lowers herself into the defendant's seat. Her eyes are swollen, red from hours, maybe days of crying. Her name is Margaret Sullivan. Within moments, she will reveal something so painful, so deeply human, 4, that it will silence the courtroom and lead Judge Judy to do something she has never done in nearly 3 decades on the bench. She will rise, step away from her position, 4, and leave behind the structure of law for a moment that transcends it. Because what unfolds here is not just a legal dispute, it is the exposure of a harsh reality, one that forces impossible decisions on the most vulnerable. 4. The plaintiff is David Morrison, a 62-year-old landlord who owns a modest 12-unit building in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. But his connection to Margaret goes far beyond rent and property. 4. David was the closest friend of Margaret's late husband, Robert. Their bonds stretched back over 50 years. They fought side by side in Vietnam in 1968, endured the same horrors, and returned home together. 4. For over 4 decades, 43 years, Margaret and Robert lived in David's building. They paid their rent faithfully, never once missing a payment. Until 3 months ago, that's when everything changed. Margaret stopped paying rent. 4. She stopped answering the phone. She stopped opening the door when David knocked. And now, despite decades of friendship, David has brought her to court, asking for the $2,541 she owes. 4. The decision weighs heavily on him, but he has his own burdens, his own financial pressures. What no one in that courtroom knows, not even David, is why Margaret stopped paying. And when the truth finally comes out, 4, it will leave no one untouched. Margaret and Robert's story began in 1964 at a church gathering in Brooklyn. She was just 22, a school teacher starting her life. He was 24, working for the Postal Service, steady and dependable. They fell in love over shared dreams of a simple, honest future. They married the following year in a small ceremony surrounded by loved ones. For 58 years, they built a life together, quiet, disciplined, and full of devotion. 4. Margaret spent 35 years teaching young children. Robert delivered mail for 40 years, greeting neighbors with a smile regardless of weather or hardship. They lived within their means. They saved carefully. They never spent beyond what they could afford. Over nearly 6 decades, they built a modest retirement fund of $127,000. It wasn't wealth, but it was security. It was peace of mind. They endured tragedy along the way. 4. Their daughter Sarah died in a car accident in 1998, a loss that nearly broke them. Their son Michael moved far away, and distance slowly weakened their relationship. Their grandchildren grew up mostly out of reach. Through it all, Margaret and Robert had each other. Their apartment, rent-controlled at $847 a month, was filled with memories, photos, shared moments, a lifetime compressed into a single space. 4. And David Morrison wasn't just their landlord. He was family. He treated them with kindness, rarely raising rent, always stepping in when help was needed. Then, 18 months ago, everything shifted. 4. Robert was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Doctors gave him 6 months, 9 at most. But there was a possibility, an experimental treatment. It wasn't covered by Medicare. Insurance denied it. Still, it offered hope. The cost, $8,400 every month. Margaret faced an impossible choice, and she made it without hesitation. She chose time with her husband over everything else. Month after month, she paid for the treatment. 4. She watched their savings disappear, for $120,000, then $100,000, then less and less. But Robert remained alive. He remained with her, and that was enough. After 8 months, their savings were gone, completely. But Robert was still there, still holding her hand. So Margaret turned to credit cards, 5 of them. One after another, she maxed them out, $31,000 in total, just to keep going. Then came the moment that would define everything. 3 months ago, she had exactly $847 left, enough to pay rent or enough to pay for treatment. Not both. She sat at their kitchen table, the same place where they had shared countless mornings together, and made her choice. 4. She chose Robert, She chose 7 more days with him over the certainty of shelter, and she repeated that choice the next month. And the next, she avoided David, ignored the knocking, couldn't face explaining what she had done. Faye, the shame was overwhelming, but love outweighed it. 8 weeks ago, Robert died. He passed away in their bed, with Margaret holding his hand. He lived 7 months longer than expected, 7 months bought with everything they had. And now, Margaret sits in court, facing eviction from the only home she has known for 43 years. Judge Judy calls the case. David speaks first, his voice heavy with conflict. He explains the unpaid rent, the lack of communication, his own financial strain. Then Judge Judy turns to Margaret. Margaret struggles to speak. Tears fall freely. Finally, she whispers, "My husband died." The room shifts. Judge Judy asks when. 8 weeks ago, Margaret replies. Faye, but the timeline doesn't add up. The rent stopped 3 months ago. Judge Judy asks why. Margaret takes a breath and begins to explain. She tells the story of the diagnosis, the treatment, the cost, watching their savings vanish, of taking on debt, of sitting at that kitchen table with only $847 left. And then she says it plainly, "I chose my husband." She explains how she gave everything, every dollar, for every sacrifice, for 7 extra months. Months spent holding his hand, reading to him, comforting him, making sure he was never alone or afraid. The courtroom is silent. David Morrison covers his mouth, fears streaming down his face. Margaret continues, her voice trembling but steady. She admits she owes them money. She admits she cannot pay. She describes her monthly income, her expenses, and the reality that she will soon be homeless. And then she says something that stops everything. "I would do it all again." Judge Judy sits motionless. For the first time, she has no immediate response. Slowly, she removes her glasses. Her eyes are filled with emotion. Then, something unprecedented happens. She stands up. She walks down from the bench and approaches Margaret directly. Placing a hand gently on her shoulder, she speaks softly. "This isn't an excuse," she says. "This is a tragedy." She turns to David and asks him what he would have done if Robert had come to him for help. David breaks down. Faye, he says he would have forgiven the debt instantly. Overcome with emotion, he tears up the lawsuit right there in court. "I'm dropping the case," he says. "She doesn't owe me anything." But Judge Judy knows that isn't enough. She makes a phone call right there in the courtroom, arranging immediate support from advocacy organizations. Then she turns back to Margaret and delivers words no one expected. Her show will pay the full $31,000 medical debt. Every cent, and more than that. They will cover 6 months of rent, giving Margaret time to recover, to grieve, to rebuild. The courtroom erupts. Margaret sobs uncontrollably. David embraces her, apologizing through tears. 6 months later, Margaret remains in her apartment. Her debt is gone. She attends grief counseling. Her relationship with her son is slowly improving. David establishes a fund in Robert's name to help other elderly tenants in crisis. Margaret now volunteers, offering comfort to others facing the end of life, just as she once did for Robert. Her story spreads across millions of screens, sparking conversations about medical debt and the burdens placed on the elderly. And through it all, one truth remains clear. Margaret chose love. Judge Judy chose compassion. And in that courtroom, for one moment, humanity outweighed everything else.